last lecture, I talked about, of course, the age of discovery. The Europeans were starting to explore parts of the old world, and then, of course, especially the new world after like Columbus's voyages. Talked about Bernard Magellan, and I went into, and I even talked about some of the other explorers that were like the French, the English, and so on. So yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and move on, of course, to talk about the conquest of America. And I'm going to first talk about some of these conquistadors that were kind of well known. Of course, I'll talk about Cortes and Pizarro. Those are the ones I'll kind of get to today, which were really the most famous. Cortes, of course, who helped conquer Mexico. And yeah, Francisco Pizarro, if you know about him, he helped conquer Peru in South America, defeating and destroying the so-called Inca Empire, which you probably heard of, which is pretty well known in the Americas. Let's first talk about like what was of course, the Spanish called it La Conquista. That was the common name that they used, which means the conquest, which was where the Europeans, like the Spanish, came after the period of Columbus. They began to take over, conquer the New World, and then began to colonize it. Who were the conquistadors? The conquistadors were primarily these mercenaries that were in Spain, maybe in Portugal, that were obsessed with trying to search for riches like gold. They wanted to seek new lands to conquer, help colonize for the crown of Spain, etc. And many of them were kind of like compadres. They really were in it for to get wealthy. Some were into like the religion stuff and all that, but not so much. The word conquistador basically means conqueror. And I want to, of course, get into and talk about today some of the things that the conquistadors were obsessed about. Gold was one of definitely the main things that they were, definitely after for sure. And Hernan Cortes had a famous quote that pretty much summed up the greed of the conquistadors. And it's this quote here, which is, "We Spaniards know a sickness of the heart that only gold can cure." And so they really thought, as they saw gold coming into the country, like in Spain, etc., that there was gold everywhere. Like you could pick it up in the streets and on the houses. And there was even a case where people believed that there were these lost cities of gold that were out there. I'm going to kind of talk about some of those that were there. I'll kind of get to the conquistadors a little later about them. Let me go ahead and explain a little bit about some of these famous lost cities of gold that were kind of popular within, like in Europe at the time, and I think in the Americas, were kind of floating around at the time. There was one that's very famous, you may have heard about, which is called El Dorado. El Dorado is a name in Spanish that means different translations. The Golden Man. Some people say the Golden One or Gilded One, I think is another translation of it. And it's this legend or myth about some kind of kingdom that was in the Americas. And this king was very wealthy. He had a lot of gold and riches. And I think there's a story where they told how he would cover himself with gold dust or something like that and dive into a pool or lake or whatever. And so people wanted to go there and find this kingdom and, of course, get wealthy. And so a lot of people searched for it. I think there were cases where 1540s, a man named Francisco Orellano, who was a conquistador, searched for it in the Amazon jungle. He had others like Sir Walter Raleigh, I think, for the British for the English search for El Dorado, I believe in the 1590s. So there are all these different searches, to try and find these lost cities of gold, but they think it was probably a made-up story that may have even have originated in Europe and all that. There's another one that's kind of similar to it, which is called the so-called legend about the 7 cities of gold. I think the actual Spanish name was Cibola or Cibola y Quivira. And they think this was a story that originated in, they think, the Old World, which may have been influenced by tales such as like the tale of Prester John, believe it or not, because in the tale of Prester John, there was a story where you could find like a river of gold. It may have been also kind of like a lot of these stories, like similar to like the whole story about the Holy Grail, like if things like that, stories you may have heard of that were kind of circulating in Europe. They even made movies about it. I think it was National Treasure 2, I believe it was, with Nicolas Cage. There was like a variation of it where they supposedly find Cibola. So I think that one was in North America, and then I think El Dorado was in like South America. So it's kind of like a lot of legends that were circulating, but obviously, people were obsessed with, trying to find gold was one of their main things, of course, that the conquistadors were kind of known for. Now, I'm going to get into some examples of some of the conquistadors that were, of course, well known that, of course, came to the Americas. I'll kind of talk about some of the ones that went into North America first, which that's kind of where they went first, believe it or not. So I'll talk about that. So we have also a man that's kind of famous, who they just kind of showed in that little video, which is right before, which is Ponce de Leon. Ponce de Leon is really considered one of the first major conquistadors who, if you remember correctly, in the little short video, they talked about how Juan Ponce de Leon arrived in the Americas, believe it or not, as far back as I think something like 1493, when he came on the voyage with Columbus, his second voyage. And so that's how he ended up I think he ended up in Hispaniola first, and then he went to Puerto Rico and aided in the conquest of Puerto Rico. And he became one of the first Europeans to later explore North America. And when he was on Puerto Rico, he became the governor, and he heard about this legend about some kind of fountain of youth, which some of the natives talked about it I think in Puerto Rico. Some think it was actually talking about the Maya, but they claimed it was somewhere to the north where the Bahamas is. And so he got together this fleet that you saw in the little video, sailed up through the Bahamas, and then he eventually reached Florida. And so Ponce de Leon in 1513, like I said, would eventually explore Florida. He first explored like the east coast of it, and then they think he may have also explored up the west coast as well. Some theories he may have even had gone up to all the way to what is the panhandle of Florida. But on his second expedition to Florida, he was actually killed by Native Americans. T. Nicholas is also joining us this afternoon as well. So that was Ponce de Leon, of course, his expedition that was famous. Then they had another explorer later that came around close about the same time, 1510s, which was Vasco Nunez de Balboa. Balboa was an explorer. He was a conquistador that came to Central America in 1510s, and I believe it's actually 1513 is the correct year, but it was. But 1513, about 200 men. He eventually crossed the Isthmus of Panama, and he discovered the Pacific Ocean, which Balboa did not call it the Pacific Ocean. He called it the South Sea, or the Spanish name, which is Mar del Sur, because it looked like it was south of Panama. And so this was a few years before Magellan had discovered basically the Pacific Ocean. So I think that's the wrong year I've got there. But Pacific, but he discovers the Pacific Ocean at that point. And he would actually go on to become like a mayor and governor of Panama. And he did actually explore parts of the like where around the Pearl Islands is, like right south of Panama and all that. And Panama City would kind of be built right after that, a little later. All right, so yeah, that's Balboa discovering what is Central America and the Pacific around 1513, I think is the correct year of when that was. So yeah, you have him. Now there's another expedition they don't really talk much about, but it did happen in the conquest of America. There was the Narvaez expedition, which happened in the 1520s. And this particular expedition, Narvaez was this conquistador who had been involved in the conquest of Mexico with Cortes a few years before. And it was actually a second attempt by the Spanish to try and colonize Florida. And so with like 500, 600 men and several ships, the Spanish basically tried to explore Florida. But what happened was their fleet was wiped out by a hurricane, is what occurred. And 4 men survived out of the expedition. Alvar Nunez Cabeza de Vaca was one of the most famous of the men that survived the hurricane and came ashore. I think they think they're Texas today, where Galveston Island is. And anyway, here's kind of a map showing the expedition, the Narvaez expedition, and how Cabeza de Vaca and his men survived. And so you can see there, they actually got captured by Native Americans, like Indians captured them. And so it took him a few years for him to actually explore westward, going down through Texas and Mexico, right there. And Cabeza de Vaca is kind of famous because he's one of the first to really explore that part of what will be later the United States. And he also gave an account of it too as well. Like he kind of has like it's got different names, the actual book, but they said that's called The Account of Cabeza de Vaca. If you want the Spanish name, it's right here. It's published around 1542, but it's called the La Relation, which means the account or the story of Alvar Nunez Cabeza de Vaca. And he does kind of go into a description of the different Native American cultures that are living in that part of that area, which will be, I guess, the United States later, I guess, part of Mexico. And so it's kind of like a proto-anthropological type work that he writes, Cabeza de Vaca. And by the way, the name Cabeza de Vaca was a nickname, which meant head of a cow. So that's who de Vaca was. And it's kind of really weird about this, but when the Spanish found de Vaca in I think northern Mexico, they thought he was an Indian because he could speak some of the native languages and all. He had learned them when he had been pretty much there for several years. Then another famous explorer I'll kind of get into is Hernando de Soto, who is a very famous Spanish conquistador who also explored that part, like the southern part of what will be the United States, of course, later. De Soto was involved in a lot of different expeditions in the age of conquest under the Spanish. I kind of go through a bunch of things he was kind of known for, but actually he goes back as far as like the 1520s. He helped Francisco Cordoba conquer like Nicaragua, which is, northern part of Central America. He also went northward and explored parts of the Yucatan Peninsula, which the Spanish would go into and take over as well. Then Cortes would, conquer central Mexico as well. Then in the 1530s, he was also involved, De Soto, in conquering Peru under Francisco Pizarro, who helped, defeat the Inca Empire. He was kind of instrumental in doing that. So he was probably one of the most famous conquistadors that was involved in a lot of different missions, I guess, that they were involved in. DeSoto, of course, you can see was famous. His actual fleet came up through the Gulf of Mexico. You can see that map. They landed near Tampa Bay, and then went up through Florida, close to where Tallahassee is, and then you can see all the states they think they explored: Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi. They went into Arkansas, and then eventually they think they went into maybe Louisiana, possibly. It's been a debate about that one. They may have gone into Louisiana. They're not sure. And I think some of his forces went into part of eastern Texas as well. And DeSoto is famous for crossing. He actually was one of the first Europeans to discover the Mississippi River, and he also crossed it near where they think Memphis, Tennessee is. This is in 1541. There is a famous bridge that's there now today, which is the Hernando de Soto Bridge, which I believe is a part of the Interstate 40 bridge that runs between Memphis and into eastern Arkansas. So that's basically kind of like where he ended up. However, they think that DeSoto eventually died of, they think, some kind of natural cause, like maybe a disease or illness of some type. Kind of debate about where he died, but I think he died maybe in the eastern part of Arkansas, and his body was buried in the Mississippi River. So, but the actual expedition was not very successful, but the conquistadors, the Spanish, will later come back, and they'll begin to explore more into that area. And they'll even later found like the city of St. Augustine, which is on the east coast of Florida. Now, I did want to talk about as well Francisco Coronado. He's another famous conquistador early on that came into the Americas around the same time as also Hernando de Soto came in. And his real name is actually, his full name anyway, is Francisco Vasquez de Coronado. At one point, he was a governor in Mexico, like the northern part of Mexico, at least an area that's in the northwestern part called New Galicia. And when he was there, he heard about a legend about the so-called 7 cities of gold, which I told you about, which was called Cibola. I think he heard this rumor from the stories of Cabeza de Vaca. And so he got together an expedition of several hundred conquistadors. And also he got together hundreds of Indians to help him go up into where he thought it was. They thought it was in somewhere in the western part of the United States today. And so Coronado would end up exploring like New Mexico, Arizona, and part of the Great Plains as far east as what is actually Kansas. Here's kind of a route of Coronado's expedition, but they went up through northern Mexico. Some of his men, by the way, explored the Gulf of California, as you can see there, the western side of the Pacific. They came up through the San Pedro Valley, a river valley, and into Arizona there. And as they went into Arizona and also into New Mexico, they encountered a bunch of these Indians that were called Pueblo. The Pueblo Native Americans, or Pueblo Indians that live in the southwestern parts now the United States, like the so-called Zuni, Hopi Indians, and many of them were famous for living in these adobe mud huts, which were made of like earth and straw primarily. And the Spanish called it a pueblo, the actual huts they lived in. And so the term pueblo was often used to describe these Indians that lived in these areas. And Coronado thought that these natives were actually, part of this 7 cities of gold, etc. His expedition, by the way, also, if you go here, found famously the Grand Canyon. Like some of his men under Garcia Lopez de Cardenas, who was a conquistador under him, was the one that first explored the Colorado Basin. They found the Grand Canyon. And as you know, the Grand Canyon is very famous for being carved out, like, I guess, millions of years ago by water. And of course, a big tourist attraction today. The Spanish, believe it or not, most of them were not impressed with it. Believe it or not, when they found the Grand Canyon, that was just because they didn't find any gold that was there. There's another image of the Grand Canyon. Just went there a few years ago. It's pretty. Believe it or not, a lot of people fall off of it and die, like every year, I think I've heard. So anyway, so that's basically the expedition of Coronado. So yeah, Coronado's expedition, he would come back, but he basically would end up really not finding any riches. He died actually later, poor man. There is one thing about Coronado I did want to mention about him. He was very cruel to a lot of the Native American cultures that were there. And I guess when they wouldn't tell him where the gold was or whatever, he basically killed them. If they wouldn't convert to Christianity, I think he also killed them as well. But you can kind of understand why all the livestock, like the horses and the cattle, end up in the American West later because of bringing all that up into the western part of where the United States is, of course, today. Right, I'm going to, of course, move on next. We're, of course, going to get into the main meat, of course, of the famous conquistadors. Of course, I'm going to talk about the two big ones that were most famous, which were Cortes and also Pizarro. And, of course, the one on the left, of course, I'll talk about first today, Hernan Cortes. He really was the most famous of the conquistadors. He really had the greatest success, probably was one of the most wealthiest of the conquistadors, and he didn't really have any military experience. Like most conquistadors were soldiers, and even had fought in Spain a lot. But Cortes was actually a schoolboy. He had, I think, going to school at the time, studying to be a lawyer. And Cortes realized that he could make a fortune in the New World because he was starting to find all these discoveries that Columbus had found in the New World. And so Cortes got on a ship and came to, I think, eventually Hispaniola, Cuba, and even at one point owned some land, of course, in the Caribbean. And however, he hears about this empire that's in Mexico, which was called the Aztec Empire, which ruled over a good chunk of central Mexico, where the Valley of Mexico is today. And so he wanted to get wealthy, conquering part of the New World and all that. And a little information about the Aztecs themselves have as a culture. The Aztecs were actually a Native American alliance that lived in the Valley of Mexico. This is like the area where Mexico City is today. The people were often called different names. Nahuatl is the common name. They're often called because that's what they called their language. Some called them Aztec or Azteca. I think some even called them Mexico was another name that they were dubbed. Because of the Aztecs, that in their language, that's where we get a lot of the words today. Avocado, the word chili, chipotle, like the restaurant, chocolate, the word addle, for a throwing spear, coyote, and even the word tomato, believe it or not, these are all Aztec words. They were later kind of borrowed and used in other languages like English, etc. Now, I'll get to it later. He's going to eventually meet this famous emperor of theirs, which, of course, will be Montezuma. We'll talk about Montezuma later, a little about him. Now Cortez first invaded Mexico with only like 500 something men. Very few men were actually involved in the actual conquest. The conquistadors had such a superior weaponry. The weaponry was like guns and cannon and swords and armor, crossbow, and so that gave really the conquistadors an advantage when they invaded, which they first went into the Yucatan, Cortez. And when he arrived there, he didn't know the language of the Aztecs. And so if you know about this, Cortez acquired this slave girl who was actually Maya, who went by the name Donna Marina. They also called her other names such as La Malinche. I think also some in Mexico called her Malintzin as well. I think La Malinche meant the captain's woman, and she became like the interpreter for Cortez and kind of helped Cortez eventually conquer Mexico because of that. I think some people in Mexico don't like her. Just think he's like Elvira, the Mistress of the Dark, or something like that, that kind of thing. So yeah, she's kind of very important. And I think they were lovers too, because the story goes that she and Cortez eventually had a son named Martin Cortez, who later ends up being one of the first mestizos that's born, which is a mix of European and Indian. Now I'll talk about, of course, here's the route, of course, that Cortez would take as he would go from where the Gulf of Mexico is to the capital of the Aztecs, which is Tenochtitlan, right there. He actually founded a city on the Gulf of Mexico, Cortez, which is Veracruz, which is like right here, basically on that western coast of the Gulf of Mexico. And when Cortez invaded, he would eventually come to the capital of Mexico City, which you see there, which is Tenochtitlan, which was a city which was built on an island in the middle of a lake, which was called Lake Texcoco. And of course, he's going to go there to meet the leader of the Aztecs, which is Emperor Montezuma, or Moctezuma, as he's called, Montezuma II. And there's, of course, kind of a picture of their capital, which later is now present-day Mexico City. Most of the old city is mostly in the center, and most of the actual lake has been drained. They got rid of the water over time. Here's some other images, of course, showing the capital of the Aztecs, which they think was one of the greatest capitals in the Americas, highly advanced with technology, and it had these causeways that ran from the mainland into where the island was. It had these huge temples that were in the middle, which you can see, which they used to worship some of their gods. Now, Montezuma, by the way, was one of the last emperors of Mexico. And according to legend, the Aztecs believed that one day a god would return named Quetzalcoatl, which they thought would look like a white man, believe it or not. And so when Cortez met Montezuma on November 8th, 1519, in their capital, they thought he was actually an Aztec god, which was Quetzalcoatl, the feather serpent god. So they thought there was a legend that this god would return because he had been banished, and he shows up in the same year when they think he's going to show up, and all that. And so Cortez is able to take advantage of that because they think he's a god, and all that. And so one of the things that happens is that Cortez basically captures Montezuma. He actually takes him hostage. He says, basically, if you don't do what I say, I'm going to kill you. And so he basically seizes power. But what ends up happening is the Aztecs, within a few months later, realize that Montezuma is like a puppet of basically Cortes. And so in June, late June of 1520, I think June 30th was the date, the Aztecs rebel against Cortes. Basically a bunch of his men had to escape, try to cross the causeways. And this became known by the Spanish later as being called the La Noche Triste, which is the night of sorrows, or the night of, I think the night of rain or something like that. And a bunch of his men actually got captured by the Aztecs and they were killed. But Cortes is able to get Indian allies. Part of why Cortes is able to conquer, there's an image, of course, of Montezuma, by the way, meeting Cortes, which there's been a lot of paintings made of it over the years, right there. So it's like the meeting of the old world and the new world at that point. What happens is they have this thing called the Siege of Tenochtitlan, or some people call it the Fall of Tenochtitlan. And what happened was Cortes went and got Indian allies. There was one state that was called Tlaxcala, which was kind of like north of Tenochtitlan, that hated the Aztecs and wanted to have them defeated and all that. And so they decided to side with the Spanish and Cortes. I guess they saw the writing on the wall in that, their culture might get snuffed out. And so they sent Indian forces to aid Cortes. And he actually he built ships, these brigantines, and he actually used ships to lay siege to their capital. And it took something like 2.5 months, like from May to about August 1521. But Cortes eventually retook the city and destroyed it pretty much. So one of the things that's going to happen, after the fall of Tenochtitlan, is that the Spanish are going to basically build a new city there, which will be Mexico City. It'll be built on top of the old ruins of Tenochtitlan. That becomes one of the first major cities that the Spanish build in the New World, besides, I guess, Santo Domingo, which they pretty much have already built before that. So that's something that's famous about the conquest of America. And of course, the atrocities were pretty bad. I think there's debate on that, how many natives died, like the Aztecs, but it's anywhere from 40,000 or more. So now let me talk about also Francisco Pizarro. He was also another famous conquistador who was well known, involved in the conquest, he lived between the 15th and 16th centuries. In fact, Pizarro was really old. In fact, when he died, he was in his 60s. So he was kind of an old conquistador compared to some of the other ones who were pretty young. Pizarro was known for his conquest of Peru, which is in South America, which was part of the Inca Empire there, which the Inca Empire was a Native American empire that was up in the Andes Mountains, which stretched from like Ecuador, Peru, and all the way down into Chile. And the Incas were actually called the Quechua people, which is a type of language that they spoke. And a little bit about the background of Pizarro. Pizarro originally landed in the New World early on, like in the 1510s, with Balboa. Something about Balboa, who found the Pacific Ocean in 1513. At one point, he helped to found the city of Panama City in Panama today. And he at one point was the mayor of it, like the mayor of the city, early 1500s. And he hears about the Inca Empire, which the Inca Empire was like almost like El Dorado to, they think, the Spanish. And maybe that's where the whole El Dorado thing came from originally. And so he got together a small force and eventually invaded into the northern part of South America, which it took him, by the way, several expeditions to basically get into South America. Apparently, at the beginning, he wasn't too successful, if you hear about it. And there was a case where I think on an island, I think off the coast of South America, a bunch of his men didn't want to do it. They wanted to go back to Panama. And so he had to make this big speech to them to get him to go into more into the interior of South America. And it's a very famous story. He famously drew a line in the sand. And he made a famous quote, which is very well known as part of a speech, I guess, boost their morale or whatever. And he said famously, "There lies Peru with its riches. Here, Panama in its poverty. Choose each man what best becomes a brave Castilian." And believe it or not, only 13 men went with him. That's it. Initially, when he went into South America, other men would join up later, but most of them went back in, I guess, in poverty back in Panama. And so, yeah, he ends up being pretty wealthy too, like Cortes as well. Of course, eventually what would happen, he would invade into South America, and I think it's in 1532 with a small force, I think not even 200 men, believe it or not. He would invade Peru. And at what is the city of Cajamarca, which is in Peru today, he captured the Inca ruler, whose name is Atahualpa. The Incas were ruled by these emperors who were pretty powerful. They're almost like gods, the way they're powerful. And but he's able to capture them because the conquistadors just have better weaponry. They're fighting with like obsidian weapons and so on like that. They have like in the Americas, and there's no chance, really. And Atahualpa, realizing that he might be killed by the Spanish, decides to basically give the Spanish a ransom money, so they won't kill him, basically. And what ends up happening, if you know the story about this, he takes like a large size room and he fills the whole thing with riches, gold, silver, whatever else kind of, I guess, jewelry they have. And this just, obviously helps to kind of, make the conquistadors want more wealth overall. He supposedly did it within like 2 months, which is amazing. And so they had that much wealth, the Incas. So that's kind of where the whole El Dorado thing, I guess, comes from. And so 24 tons of gold, that's about how much he filled that room, not including probably like silver and other stuff. So that's like something like worth today, like $850 million in today's riches overall. Of course, if you know what happened, instead of, he wouldn't end up freeing him or anything like that. What happened was Pizarro decided he killed him the next year, 1533, turns around, kills Atahualpa, and then later he would put his brother in power as the Inca ruler, who's Manco Inca. And basically the rulers after that kind of come in like Manco are kind of put in as like puppet rulers is what they are. Manco Inca, he was treated pretty bad. I think at one point they even like raped his own wife, believe it or not. And so 1536, Manco Inca decided to rebel. A huge rebellion, which took place in the capital of Cusco, which Cusco was the capital of the Inca Empire at the time. And so he was able to amass something like 200,000 Inca warriors to try to march on Pizarro's forces that were there. And it led to a siege. The so-called Siege of Cusco is what it's usually called, which lasted from 1536 to 1537. There's actually this fortress they fought over, which is called Sacsayhuaman in Cusco today, which was built by the Incas years ago. And some of the stones there you're looking at weigh like over 100 tons. This in some of the construction of these types of fortresses and buildings that they built, the Incas, because a lot of the Incas built things out of stone, in South America and all that. But in the end, the whole thing failed. It did fail the actual siege because here's some of the images of the actual part of the fortress that you're looking at. But basically, the Incas weren't able to overcome, the firepower of the conquistadors. And then on top of that, disease like smallpox, measles, took such a toll on Manco Inca's forces that he was forced to give up on 1537. From there, what happened was he then retreated. If you know about this, Manco Inca retreated into the jungle of Peru, and he tried to build this neo-Incan state or empire that would be kind of separate from the Spanish, what they were trying to carve out of Peru. And he even built a new capital in like the jungles of Peru that was later called Vilcabamba, which some people called it the so-called lost city of the Incas. That's actually not it. I know for years people sometimes look up that word Vilcabamba and that'll come up, but that's actually not it. That's actually another city that he built later called Vitkos, because he had to abandon the other one because I think the Spanish found Vilcabamba, and so he had to retreat even further. And I think today it's called or near Rosapata is one of the names they call it as well. We got another image of that one too. You may have heard of. That's Machu Picchu. That actually was not a city. That actually was an Inca citadel and palace of the Incas that was built in the mid 15th century in basically in the Andes Mountains in Peru. And apparently that was actually never found by the Spanish for some reason. And it wasn't until like 1911 that an American archaeologist named Hiram Bingham stumbled upon it, exploring parts of the Andes Mountains and all that. And so, yeah, it's amazing how some of these Incas could build lavish, buildings like that you're looking at below. It's actually not a city. It's more like a citadel and palace complex of one of the Inca rulers that was built. So it's high up in the mountains there in the Andes. Now, Pizarro actually was later killed, if you know about this. Like some of his men killed him, believe it or not. But basically from there, the Spanish start carving out a lot of different colonies, like in South America, and then also in pretty much in northern Latin America and part of even North America as well that you're looking at. And one more thing I forgot to talk about, which you can see in that map right there. There is one thing that Pizarro did do, which is famous before he died, was that he founded the capital of Peru, which is Lima, which is on the Pacific Ocean. That becomes kind of like the main city that's in Peru that kind of replaces, I guess, Cusco as being, not as important. So that's something he was famous for. Pizarro was founding that, even though he was like ruthless, conquistador and all that. He is kind of, his legacy today is probably that, more or less. Now, you look at that map there, the Spanish by between, I guess, the 16th and 17th centuries starts to carve out colonies throughout the Americas, mostly in Latin America. Primarily, they had two main ones that they first found in the 16th century. You can see those two at the top. First, they had the viceroyalty of New Spain. And then the other one was, of course, the viceroyalty of Peru, each having a major capital or city. New Spain had Mexico City, and of course, Peru had Lima, had as well. New Spain included different areas. New Spain included, you can see kind of those dark areas, but mostly it included most of Mexico, part of North America, up to where it says San Francisco right there. It also included Central America, the Caribbean, the Philippines, and also Guam. So all those areas were kind of condensed into one big colony that the Spanish called New Spain, just like the biggest colony they had pretty much in their empire. Now you can see Peru. Peru, I think, was mostly Peru, and I think part of Chile was the areas that they controlled right there. Later, they added two other ones. They had also one that was called New Granada, the Viceroyalty of New Granada, which included like the northern part of South America. That would be like Colombia, also Ecuador, Panama, and then Venezuela. So all those were included in that particular Viceroyalty colony of the Spanish, which was not developed really until the 18th century. And then the other one they broke up, another colony, was the one called the Viceroyalty of the Rio de la Plata, which is named after the Platte River, just down there by Buenos Aires. That included Argentina, Chile, Bolivia, Paraguay, and Uruguay. So all those countries will eventually come out of that, which are in the Americas. Central America kind of break up later as well. Central America, most of it was actually under the Viceroyalty of New Granada, actually, eventually. If you go to this slide here, the Spanish colonies were eventually broken up. Like, why do they call it a viceroyalty? Well, they were governed by these governors that were under the king that was called a viceroy. They basically ruled in the king's name because, the king can't be there, like, say, in the New World or wherever else it is in the world. They have colonies. And then also they have a bunch of court systems that are underneath the viceroy that help govern the colony as well. And then they have also a colonial council, which helps run the government, which is called a cabildo. And you can see here they have different they had different courts that they had. They had like what they call, you see there, real audiencia. And they also had what they call a corregidor. The corregidor was like a municipal local court. And the real audiencia was like an appellate court, like an appeals court that they had. And so a lot of the judges that were under a lot of these Spanish court systems were really powerful. In fact, a lot of countries in Latin America, they don't have a jury system like we have. They have more or less jurists or judges that basically deal with cases, court cases or whatever. Now, cabildo is like a council that runs like a colony, and they call it cabildo because of the fact that the actual building of where the government is called a cabildo. I don't know if you've ever been down to New Orleans near Jackson Square, but they got the Louisiana State Museum Cabildo building that's there. And so that's basically where the Spanish controlled, like, Louisiana when it was under Spanish rule, et cetera. That was their main, I guess, consul building that ran it. Another thing that the Spanish are known for, is something they kind of set up after Columbus came, was the so-called caste system. It's called different names, caste or casta. I think the common Spanish name I'll put on the screen is the Sistema de Castas, I think is what they usually call it. And it's a hierarchical system based off of race, depending on what your race, ethnicity, and it even divides people up into mixed races that are pure or less pure overall. I know in India they have something similar to that as well, which they call the caste system, which I think the word caste in Latin is from Portuguese too, which can mean also pure as well. Because I think the more European you were, the more pure blood you were overall. So yeah, the term caste, it can mean, it means lineage, but I think also some people use the term pure also as well. Obviously, those that were more European, like I said, had more higher status than those that were like, say, pure Indian or pure African colonists or slaves that are there. They tended to break people up into different classes based off of their race, ethnicity. So those on top of higher status were mostly called peninsulars. These are Europeans that were born in the old world on the Iberian Peninsula, like we Spanish, Portuguese, basically. Then Criollo, since they say Creoles, which is more the French term, Spanish is actually Criollo. These are basically Spanish or Portuguese that are born in America. They're mostly Spanish, Portuguese descent, and those are considered the two that were really the higher status. They also had, you see below that, they had what they call mestizo. Mestizo was somebody that was a racial mix of European and Indian. So it could be different kinds of mixtures. It could be someone who's more European, which I think they call it a castizo, or it could be somebody who's more Indian. So you might have 3/4 Indian, 1/4 Spanish, or vice versa. I think they even have like different, you can see that little picture showing the different race mixtures. They even have like posters they made where they show the different classifications of race ethnicity that were in the Spanish Empire and all that. They also had mulatto, which mulatto is more of a racial mixture of African and European. I know in like America, like especially like Louisiana, they also use the term Creole for the same thing, which could be a mix. Because you could have like, black Creole versus white Creole and all of that. But it could be Spanish, French, or Portuguese Creole as well. The Spanish didn't use the word Creole for that. They used mulatto, is what it is. Then, of course, Negro or black, of course, these are people of African slave descent as well. They were, of course, brought in later as slaves. Actually, Indian slavery didn't work out like they wanted. And then Indio or Indians, they're talking about Native American Indians, basically were considered one of the lowest castes because when the Spanish came in, they started using Native Americans as like slave labor, something they're known for. Yeah, here's a more wider picture showing you the different classifications, but they actually had posters or whatever they made, or paintings they made back then of the different classifications that existed within the casta. Of course, one of the things that the Spanish were known for after the time of Columbus was they created this thing called the encomienda system, which the encomienda was a Spanish labor system that basically used the labor of Native Americans. It was like a forced labor system, pretty much. And but because in fact the Spanish believed that since they were non-Christian and all that they could enslave them. A lot of them were pagan. They practiced cannibalism. They human sacrifice and things like that. And so they believed that they had a right to do that. However, you can see there that the Spanish settlers that came in were called encomienderos. They could be given Indians, which they were supposed to protect, care for them and their land, and then Christianize them, make them into good Christians and things like that. But in reality, they kind of exploited them, used them as slave labor. And because of the harshness of the conditions and also the diseases, the European diseases that were brought in, a lot of indigenous peoples ended up dying. Which is kind of a debate about that, about how many Native American peoples died in the Americas. Some estimate between 2 million to 15 million may have died. Some of that might be exaggerated. They're not sure exactly. But those are sometimes the numbers that they list, the amount of people that actually died overall. They think the system was developed not by Columbus, but they think after Columbus died, and they start creating it. Now they had this man named Bartholomew de las Casas. He was really one of the first Spanish to kind of come to this idea that what the Spanish were doing to the Native Americans was cruel, and he basically he helped get the encomienda system banned over time, and in basically Indian slavery and what became known as the New Laws of 1542. They were issued by Emperor Charles V. And here's the Las Casas. He lived from 1484 to 1566. He had a nickname. He was called the Protector of the Indians. And he had actually written an account, which was called, you see there, the brief account of the devastation of the Indies. And he uncovered the fact that after the Spanish had taken over the Caribbean, most of the indigenous peoples that were there had all either been wiped out or killed. And so he kind of uncovered this, what happened, of how cruel the Spanish had been to the Native American cultures and all that. And he was involved in this thing you may have heard of called the Valladolid debate, where in Spain he argued that the Native Americans ought to have better treatment and rights. They shouldn't be, slaves to the Spanish. And he had been opposed by this other, there was a Spanish man named, I'll put his name on the screen. His name was Juan de Sepulveda. He said that, part of why the Indians deserved to be enslaved was because they had practiced, like I said, human sacrifice. They had been cannibals, like eating humans, and they weren't Christian, a lot of them. They hadn't converted and all of that. But in the end, the Emperor Charles V would actually side with Bartholomew de las Casas, and eventually they would end up banning Indian slavery, which would take a while, but eventually it got banned by the late 16th century. They start replacing it and all that. There was an irony, though, about it. I think in the Valladolid debate, one of the things that Las Casas talked about was he thought that they ought to replace Indian slavery with African slavery. And so that's actually what the Spanish did. And so the Spanish started bringing in Africans instead into the Americas. And that's why all these African people end up, like say in Brazil and South America and Central America and all of that. They do have this thing called the repartimiento system. One thing that the Spanish did was they replaced the encomienda with what they call tribute labor. So this meant that Native American Indians would have to give so much tribute labor during the year, which might be weeks, might be months. And so I think in France, they call it the corvée system or something like that. And that kind of partially replaced the encomiendo. And then eventually they went to the hacienda, was the other thing they went to, which are these large landed estates or plantations that they created throughout the Americas. Or I guess they were kind of like paid laborers instead. And the hacienda owners were called hacendados, what they called them. But the Spanish, would have like a boom. Like you study about what happened with the Spanish Empire between like the 16th and 17th centuries. You'd have just thousands and thousands of people that would go to the New World. It's part of why the Spanish Empire declined. It was like a brain drain, everybody leaving and going to the New World. And eventually the Spanish Empire peaked by 1810. It had like something like 5 million something square miles in size, but it wasn't really a power compared to, say, Britain, France, or some of these other countries that were in Europe. There is a thing about the Spanish I usually talk about, which is famous. They did have this thing called the Black Legend, which is something they used to talk about with the Spanish. And it's this belief that the Spanish Empire had been built off of basically being cruel or evil, that it was just naturally evil or whatever. But they think that a lot of that was propaganda that was created by countries that were anti-Catholic, like England and others. They think a lot of it is exaggerated. and untrue about it. I don't think they were doing this on purpose to do this. They thought this was the best way to, I guess, run their empire or whatever. But it is something that's kind of associated with the modern state of the Spanish Empire at the time overall. Yeah, you can see kind of a map here, right here. You can see all the areas that the Spanish would eventually colonize and take over. So you can see pretty much from Florida and Louisiana, like, Spanish Florida, Spanish Louisiana. You got Mexico, Central America, the Caribbean, pretty much all South, a lot of South America, minus Brazil for a while, was controlled by the Spanish. You can see right there. Then later, all that's going to kind of be broken up into different countries, especially when they have the so-called Latin American revolutions that break out between the 18th and the 19th centuries. You'll see all these new countries that form. You see pretty much as in that map that's on the right overall. By the way, part of why Latin America boomed, like the colonies, was because of mining, because the fact that the Spanish found a lot of gold and silver, like in Mexico and also in Peru and all that. And so that helped to kind of boom the whole Spanish colonialism in the New World. Also, sugarcane was big too, about that in the Caribbean and all that. It's kind of like what they call white gold or something like that, they called it. But yeah, I think the Spanish crown even went so far as to tax mineral rights with the so-called quinto real. Sometimes called the royal fifth or the king's fifth. And it was a 20% tax on mineral rights, whatever you want to mine and all that. But anyway, that's kind of the history of the conquistadors. It's kind of more of a compressed lecture, I think, on it that I have. But I'm going to, of course, be moving on. Well, I'll kind of go away from the New World. I'm going to, of course, talk next this week and probably part of next week, we'll get into discussing the age of absolutism. I'll get into and discuss like the rise of France, the rise of the Austrian Habsburgs in Central Europe. We'll talk about the rise of Prussia, the rise of Russia. These are all major powers, of course, that'll develop in early modern Europe as a whole. Looks like Abigail was joining us late, so hey, if you're still watching there overall. But before I go today, I want to talk about a few reminders about assignments that are out. The Reformation quiz, of course, is still out right now. So I think that's due in a few days. I might extend it a few days if you need it. Now, I did post a new quiz, of course, which will be on world exploration. Not sure what I'll do about the conquistadors. It'll either be a quiz or be on the first exam coming up, I guess, in a couple weeks or whatever it is we're coming up. But that's it for today overall. I'm not sure about Friday what I'm going to do, but Friday will either be a live lecture or will be recorded. So I'm not sure which I'll do. No, Friday's my birthday coming up. So anyway, so I probably might have plans and all that. But anyway, y'all take care. Have a great weekend. Don't forget, I do have a discussion going on right now in the Reformation, which is on, I think, the study guide questions that are there. So I think it's still open right now for a few days. But I think the second half hasn't been done all the way on the study guide questions there. So try to share those answers with other students, and I'll try to see if I can look at that later. So y'all take care and have a great weekend coming up later in the week and all that. So y'all take care.